David Thornton has published 47 peer-reviewed papers on ursine behavioral ecology. He cannot publish number 48, not because the data is flawed. His observations were meticulous even as his life drained away at the bottom of that ravine, but because what he witnessed suggests bears possess cognitive abilities that would require rewriting a century of wildlife biology, and because the scientific community isn't ready to accept that 4 grizzlies held a conference about saving a human life. It happened on a Tuesday in September, the kind of crystalline autumn day that makes Yellowstone's backcountry feel like sacred ground. Aspens turning gold against dark pine, air so clean it hurt to breathe. David was doing what he'd done 1,000 times before, tracking a collared grizzly through remote terrain, documenting movement patterns, checking equipment function. Bear F317, a mature female he'd been monitoring for 3 years. Routine fieldwork for a man who'd spent 30 years studying these animals. He was 62 years old, experienced enough to know the risks, confident enough to work alone, despite protocol suggesting otherwise. Most veteran researchers bent that rule. The backcountry doesn't accommodate partnerships well. Slow pace, silent observation, hours of waiting. David preferred solitude. He understood these forests, understood bear behavior, understood the precise line between caution and paranoia. The ravine appeared without warning, hidden beneath fallen timber and dense undergrowth, concealed so perfectly that his boot hit air where he'd expected solid ground, 23 feet down onto a granite shelf. He didn't remember the fall itself, just the impact, the sound his femur made snapping, the cold certainty that something fundamental had broken. His phone shattered against rock. The GPS unit, clipped to his belt, cracked on impact. Screen dark, useless. David lay there, assessing damage with the clinical detachment of someone who'd treated injured animals in the field. Compound femur fracture, bone visible through torn fabric. Mild concussion probable, vision swimming, nausea rising, multiple contusions, superficial lacerations. But the leg was the crisis. Without stabilization, without evacuation, he had maybe 3 days before hypothermia or infection killed him. The rational part of his brain began calculations. No one knew his exact location. He deviated from his filed route that morning, following F317's unexpected movement pattern eastward. Standard practice, you follow the data where it leads. But it meant search teams wouldn't know where to look. His emergency radio had survived the fall, but only barely, receiving static, transmitting nothing. He could hear garbled ranger communications but couldn't call for help. Temperature would drop below freezing after sunset. He had an emergency blanket, 18 ounces of water, 3 granola bars, bear spray, standard day pack supplies. Not enough for survival, but enough to buy time. He wrapped the blanket around his torso, fashioned a rough splint from broken branches, and settled in to wait. 3 days, maybe 4 if he was lucky. Someone would eventually notice his absence, initiate search protocols. Whether they'd find him in time was mathematics he didn't want to calculate. 47 minutes after the fall, F317 appeared at the ravine edge. David saw her through the pain haze, massive brown shape against blue sky, distinctive white collar visible even from below. His scientific brain engaged automatically, observing despite agony. Collared bear investigating unusual stimulus. Standard curiosity behavior. She'd probably heard the fall, come to investigate potential food source or territorial intrusion. Nothing remarkable about that. Except she didn't descend, didn't approach with the cautious aggression of a bear assessing prey. She paced the rim, back and forth, making sounds David had never heard in 3 decades of field work, low-frequency vocalizations, rhythmic huffing, specific pitch variations. Not the warning huffs of a threatened bear, not mating calls, not cub communication, something else entirely. His hand found the audio recorder in his vest pocket, miraculously intact. He activated it with trembling fingers, documented everything. Time stamp, 14:07 hours. Bear F317 at Ravine Edge, exhibiting unusual vocalization patterns. His voice sounded strange, thready, distant, shock setting in. F317 continued calling, systematic, persistent. Every 30 seconds, the same pattern, 3 short huffs, 1 extended low call, pause, repeat. She'd pace 10 feet east, vocalize, return to center, vocalize, 10 feet west, vocalize like she was broadcasting. But to what? The forest was empty. Everything inside David screamed, this was just stress-induced pattern recognition. Humans see intention where none exists. It's why ancient peoples invented gods to explain thunder. His mind, drowning in pain and fear, was constructing narrative from random animal behavior. But his recorder was running. Later, spectral analysis would show those vocalizations had structure, frequency modulation, rhythmic precision. The scientific part of him noted it all. The dying part wondered if he'd hallucinate before the end. The human part, the part he'd trained himself to suppress in the field, felt something he couldn't name. Not hope, not quite, but a whisper of something impossible. F317 stopped pacing, stood motionless at the rim looking down at him. David looked back. Their eyes met across 23 feet of empty air. Then the second bear arrived, and David's understanding of everything began to crack. The second bear materialized from the tree line like a shadow, gaining substance. Uncollared, massive. David estimated 450 pounds, adult male in prime condition. Under normal circumstances, F317 would display defensive behavior. Grizzlies are solitary outside mating season, fiercely territorial. A female and unrelated male in close proximity should trigger aggression, avoidance, or at minimum cautious distance. F317 didn't move, didn't huff warnings, didn't posture. The male approached the ravine edge, stopped 6 feet from F317, and looked down, directly at David. The bear's gaze wasn't predatory. David had seen that look before, the cold assessment of a hunter evaluating prey. This was different, focused, deliberate. The male studied him for perhaps 20 seconds, then turned his head toward F317 and vocalized. A low, rumbling sound, specific duration, specific pitch. F317 responded, different sound, higher frequency. The male called again. F317 answered. David's scientific training screamed coincidence. 2 bears investigating an unusual stimulus, human at bottom of ravine, scent of blood, sounds of distress. Independent curiosity bringing them to the same location. It happened. Not common, but documented. His own research included 3 cases of multiple bears at single food sources, but this wasn't a food source, and the pattern continued, back and forth, specific call from F317, specific response from male. The exchange had rhythm, structure, like conversation. His recorder captured everything. Time stamp, 14:32 hours. Second bear, unidentified adult male, engaging in apparent vocal exchange with F317. David's voice cracked as he narrated. The pain in his leg had become white fire, burning through shock's protective numbness. He'd need to update his condition assessment soon. But first, document the behavior. Always document. 63 minutes later, the third bear arrived. Subadult female, perhaps 3 years old, approaching independence but not fully mature. She came from the west, different direction than the male. Emerged from heavy timber, paused at the clearing edge, continued straight to the ravine. No hesitation, no exploratory wandering, direct approach like she knew exactly where she was going. 3 grizzlies. Within 2 hours, at a ravine with no food source, no carcass, no territorial marker. In 30 years of fieldwork, David had never documented spontaneous congregation like this. Never read about it in literature. Grizzlies don't gather without cause, mating, feeding, or maternal bonding. This was none of those. The subadult joined the others at the rim. All 3 looked down at David. He looked back, feeling increasingly disconnected from reality. Maybe this was dying. Maybe his oxygen-starved brain was constructing elaborate hallucinations to cushion the approach of death. That would be more rational than what his observations suggested. Then the 4th bear appeared, and rational explanations shattered completely. Older male, heavily scarred across the muzzle, grizzled coat suggesting advanced age. He moved slowly, deliberately, with the careful gait of an animal carrying old injuries. He came from the north, 4th direction, 4th bear, positioned himself at the ravine edge with the others. 4 apex predators maintaining non-aggressive proximity. 4 grizzlies focused on a single point, the broken human bleeding at the bottom of a ravine. David's field notes had documented thousands of bear observations. None prepared him for this. They began vocalizing to each other, not simultaneously, taking turns. F3117 would call, the scarred male would respond. The younger male would add a different sound. The subadult female contributed shorter huffs. Back and forth, a pattern David's failing consciousness couldn't map, but recognized as organized, structured, intentional. His scientific brain was screaming now. This couldn't be communication about him. That would require theory of mind, understanding that other beings have thoughts, intentions, knowledge. It would require intentional information sharing, collaborative problem assessment. Bears don't do that. His 47 published papers said bears don't do that. But his eyes, his recorder, his meticulous documentation said they were doing exactly that. The sun moved lower. Temperature dropped. David's leg had swollen grotesquely, fabric cutting into flesh. Early shock symptoms progressed. Pale skin, rapid heartbeat, confusion creeping at the edges of thought. He activated his emergency blanket, the metallic crinkle startling the bears momentarily. They settled again, maintaining their vigil. Vigil. Wrong word, implied intention, purpose, care. David mentally corrected himself, maintaining their presence, neutral terminology, objective observation. Except there was nothing neutral about 4 grizzlies coordinating their attention on a dying researcher, nothing objective about the sounds they made, the way they looked at him, then at each other, then back at him. His recorder was still running, 4 hours of battery life remaining, enough to document whatever happened next. Whether that was his death observed by 4 witnesses or something his training insisted was impossible. What happens when intelligent animals encounter a problem they can't solve alone? That's when F3117 disappeared into the forest and returned, dragging something. F317 emerged from the tree line dragging a fallen branch, not carrying it in her mouth, dragging it the way a bear moves a heavy obstacle, blocking access to food. The branch was substantial, perhaps 8 feet long, thick as David's forearm. She'd travelled at least 50 yards with it, evidenced by the fresh scrape marks through pine needles and disturbed earth. She positioned herself at the ravine edge, directly above David, used her claws to grip the branch, adjusted its angle with deliberate precision, then pushed it over the rim. It fell end over end, crashed onto the granite shelf 12 feet from where David lay, far too short to bridge the gap, useless as a climbing aid. But the intent was unmistakable. She'd attempted to provide a tool, a physical solution to the problem of his trapped position. David's scientific training offered immediate explanation. Tool use, documented in bears attempting to extract food rewards. She was trying to retrieve him, fish him out like salmon from a stream. Predatory behavior with modified methodology, except the behavior pattern was wrong. Bears manipulating tools to access prey show frustration, aggression, food-motivated persistence. F3Y17 showed none of that. She dropped the branch, stepped back, and appeared to be assessing, evaluating the failed attempt. The other 3 bears watched, no competition for the prize, no interference, just observation. The scarred male approached the rim after perhaps 90 seconds. Different strategy entirely. He used his massive paws to push loose rocks and vegetation over the edge. Dirt, small stones, clumps of moss, creating a pile, a ramp. The material accumulated at the ravine base but created nothing climbable, nothing useful. Yet he continued for several minutes, methodical, focused, then stopped, stepped back. Like F317, he appeared to assess the result. 2 bears, 2 different approaches to the same problem, sequential attempts, modified methodologies. David's consciousness was fragmenting from pain and shock, but his observational training held. He narrated into the recorder, words slurring. Timestamp, 16:09 hours, multiple bears exhibiting apparent coordinated problem-solving behavior. Approaches suggest trial and error, methodology, iteration. The subadult female tried next. She disappeared into the forest, returned, dragging a longer branch, nearly 10 feet, thicker than F317's choice. But she didn't attempt to move it alone. The older male approached, and together they manipulated the branch toward the ravine edge. 1 bear gripping the base, 1 positioning the top. Coordinated effort, collaborative object manipulation. David watched through swimming vision. 2 grizzlies working in apparent coordination to manipulate a single tool, not fighting over it, not competing, cooperating. The branch still proved too short. Wrong angle, it crashed into the ravine, landing closer than F317's attempt, but still useless. The 2 bears stepped away, no aggression between them despite the failed collaboration, no resource guarding. They'd attempted something together, it hadn't worked, and they simply stopped. 3 hours since the fall. David's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The swelling in his leg had become grotesque, fabric-cutting circulation, skin mottled purple and red. Shock symptoms intensifying, pale skin, rapid shallow breathing, confusion clouding thought. He was cold despite the emergency blanket, shivering uncontrollably. He pulled the blanket tighter, tried to focus. Had to document this. Had to record what was happening, even if no one would believe it. His voice on the recorder sounded distant, disconnected. If found, analysis of vocalizations essential, behavior unprecedented, consciousness fading, multiple bears engaging in iterative problem-solving, each failure leading to modified approach. This is real. This is happening. I'm watching it happen. The 4 bears remained at the rim. They'd tried physical solutions, branches, materials, collaborative manipulation. Nothing had worked. David was still trapped, still dying. The temperature continued dropping as afternoon slid toward evening. Maybe an hour of useful daylight remaining. They were trying to help him. The thought cut through his scientific training like a blade through water. They were trying to help. Not scavenge, not hunt. Help. Coordinated assessment, multiple solution attempts, collaborative effort. This was cognition. This was intelligence. This was impossible. His rational mind rejected it. Anthropomorphism, the cardinal sin of wildlife biology. Projecting human motivation onto animal behavior, seeing intention where only instinct existed. But his data rejected the rejection. Coordinated tool use, multiple attempt modifications, collaborative object manipulation, sequential problem-solving with different bears trying different approaches. This wasn't random, this wasn't instinct, this was thinking. What do intelligent animals do when their physical solutions fail? The scarred male left, simply turned and disappeared into the forest. F-317 settled at the rim, lying down, massive head resting on her paws, maintaining watch. David's consciousness began to fracture, thought fragmenting into disconnected observations. Cold, dark, coming. Bears still here. Why still here? Can't be real. Must be real. I'm watching it. And that's when he heard human voices, male voice, young, shocked. Holy shit, there's bears everywhere. Female voice, breathless with fear. Back away slowly, don't run, just back away. David tried to shout. His throat produced only a weak rasp, barely audible over the whisper of wind through pines. He was too far down, too weak, voice shredded from hours of cold air and dehydration. The hikers couldn't hear him. They'd see the bears, panic, flee. His last chance at rescue would evaporate into the forest. The bears didn't scatter. F-317 stood, positioned herself between the approaching voices and the ravine edge. Not aggressive posture, no raised hackles, no jaw-popping, no charge preparation, blocking posture. She stood her ground, massive body creating a barrier while the other two bears moved to flank her, creating a wall between the humans and David. The voices grew closer, words distinguishable now. Why aren't they moving? Bears should be running from us. Maybe cubs nearby, we need to leave now. Wait, that scarred one, it's coming toward us. The scarred male had reappeared. David couldn't see from his position, but he heard everything. The crack of branches, the hikers' panicked breathing, the careful approach of a massive predator. Bear spray ready. It stopped. Why'd it stop? Silence. 10 seconds. 20. Then the female voice again, confused. It's walking away, back toward those other bears. What is it doing? It keeps looking back at us, like it wants us to. Bears don't. It's doing it again, walking away, stopping, turning around. The male voice, uncertain. My dog does that when he wants me to follow. This is crazy, but I think it wants us to follow it. David could hear it now. Heavy footfalls, distinctive rhythm, coming toward the voices, then away, toward, then away, leading. Bear spray ready, we stay back. First sign of aggression, we retreat. Footsteps, careful, slow, following. David wanted to weep. The scarred male had left, found humans, and was leading them back. Recruiting help when the bear's own solutions had failed. Minutes passed. Then the male hiker's voice, stunned. There's someone down there. Oh, Jesus, there's a person in that ravine. Sir, can you hear us? David found his voice, weak, cracked. Here, I'm alive. How badly hurt? Broken femur, 3-4 hours, can't climb. I'm calling 911, Jake, get coordinates. David heard the phone call, the rushed explanation. Injured hiker, remote location, helicopter required. ETA 45 minutes. Help is coming, hang on. The 4 bears remained at the ravine edge throughout, not threatening the hikers, not fleeing. The scarred male positioned himself 15 feet from the couple, close enough to observe, far enough to avoid panic. F-317 and the others watched, waited. Jake, that bear came and got us, the female hiker said quietly. We were 1/4 mile away. It led us straight here. Sarah, bears don't do that. I know, but we just watched it happen. David's recorder captured everything. 4 hours and 18 minutes of documentation. The vocalizations, the branch attempts, the hiker's testimony. Evidence that no one would believe. Who would accept that grizzlies engaged in coordinated problem-solving and recruited humans when their solutions failed? Through the shock haze, David understood he was watching his life's work collapse. Everything he'd published about bear cognition was incomplete. These animals weren't following instinct. They were making decisions, assessing problems, trying solutions, And when they couldn't solve it themselves, they'd recruited help. They'd saved his life through intelligence he'd spent 30 years insisting they didn't possess. His leg throbbed with white fire, but worse was the knowledge that those bears had demonstrated cognitive abilities science said they couldn't possess, and he couldn't prove it in a way his peers would accept. The helicopter's distant thrum grew louder. Rotor wash scattered the bears, subadult and younger male first, then the scarred male. F-317 remained longest, backing toward the tree line as the helicopter descended, but as paramedics rappelled down with equipment as they stabilized his shattered leg, David saw her, still there, watching from the pines, making sure he was safe. Emergency surgery lasted 6 hours, titanium rod through the femur, 3 pins, extensive soft tissue repair. The surgeon told David later he'd been perhaps 2 hours from losing the leg, 4 hours from losing his life. Blood loss severe, hypothermia progressing, infection already establishing in the wound. Another hour in that ravine, and the rescue would have been a body recovery. David lay in the hospital bed, morphine dulling the pain but sharpening a different agony. The bears had maintained their presence for 4 hours and 16 minutes. He knew because his recorder had captured every second until the helicopter arrived. 4 hours and 16 minutes of vigil that had kept him alive long enough for rescue. Vigil. He kept using that word, kept correcting himself. Presence, neutral terminology, objective observation. But there was nothing neutral about what had happened. His colleague brought the field recorder 3 days post-surgery. Marcus Chen, fellow researcher, 20 years of friendship. He set it on the hospital tray without comment, along with David's laptop. "Thought you might want these. Rangers recovered them with your pack." David waited until Marcus left. Then, hands shaking from medication or something deeper, he connected the recorder and began analysis. 4 hours, 16 minutes, 33 seconds of audio. He ran spectral analysis on the vocalizations, watching frequency patterns emerge on his laptop screen. The calls weren't random. They showed structure, rhythmic intervals, pitch variations, turn-taking patterns. Statistical analysis suggested intentional exchanges, not coincidental overlap. F-317's calls had specific frequency ranges. The scarred male responded in different ranges, back and forth. The pattern held across 73 separate exchanges. David's hands trembled reviewing the data. This can't be right. He ran the analysis again. Same results, a third time, same results. He pulled up every paper he'd published on bear vocalizations, reviewed the literature from colleagues worldwide. Nothing described this. Nothing explained organized vocal exchanges between unrelated bears focused on a single problem. The department head visited on day 5, Dr. Patricia Oakes, administrator for 20 years, pragmatic to her core. She wanted a full incident report for university insurance, for Park Service records. "I need more time with the data," David said. "Take what you need. Just glad you're alive." But he wasn't stalling for analysis. He was stalling because he didn't know how to write what had happened. 4 bears engaged in collaborative problem-solving and human recruitment. It sounded insane. Even with documentation, even with witness corroboration, it sounded like the morphine-addled hallucinations of a dying man. Dr. Sarah Martinez visited day 7. Cognitive ecologist, specialist in animal intelligence, colleague David trusted more than most. He showed her the preliminary audio analysis without preamble. She studied the screen in silence. 1 minute, 2. Finally, "David, this would change everything." Change what? Our understanding of Ursine cognition, social coordination, theory of mind, everything. She looked at him, eyes serious. "But no journal will publish this. They'll say you were in shock, hallucinating, misinterpreting behavior. I have witnesses, hikers who watched the scarred male lead them to the ravine. I have 4 hours of audio, I have documented behavior. I believe you. Sarah's voice was quiet. But a belief isn't enough. This challenges a century of behavioral science. You're suggesting bears possess collaborative intelligence, problem-solving abilities, recruitment behavior that exceeds documented primate cognition. The burden of proof for claims like that is enormous. David stared at the frequency patterns on his screen. 47 papers, 30 years of careful science, and now the most important data of his career was unpublishable because it was too extraordinary. His leg throbbed with phantom pain, but worse was the knowledge that those bears had demonstrated cognitive abilities science said they couldn't possess, and he couldn't prove it in a way that mattered. Sarah squeezed his shoulder. Write it anyway. Document everything. Maybe not for publication now, but for the record, for when science catches up. 3 weeks into recovery, a park ranger brought something that changed everything again. GPS data from F3117's collar. The collar David hadn't known was malfunctioning. The collar that held secrets about how 4 bears converged on a hidden ravine where a man lay dying. The ranger was young, maybe 30, carrying a tablet and an expression David recognized, the look of someone who'd reviewed data they couldn't explain. He introduced himself as Kyle Brennan, wildlife tech responsible for collar maintenance and data retrieval. Dr. Thornton, I need to show you something about F3117's collar. It's been malfunctioning for 6 weeks. We didn't catch it until the download after your rescue. Kyle set the tablet on the hospital tray, pulled up GPS tracking maps. This is her position when you fell. Time stamped 13:43 hours. David leaned forward, ignoring the pull of stitches. The GPS point showed F317 1.4 miles from the ravine location, nearly 1.5 miles away. She couldn't have heard the fall from there, David said. Not through that terrain, not with wind. No, sir, but look at her movement pattern starting 13:47. Kyle traced the line with his finger. F317 had moved directly toward the ravine. Straight line, purposeful travel, arriving at 14:07 hours, 24 minutes after David's fall. She couldn't have seen me, couldn't have heard me. That ravine is invisible until you're standing at the edge. Kyle nodded slowly. Yes, sir? That's what I can't figure. She moved directly to your location with no apparent stimulus. David stared at the map. His scientific brain offered explanations. Coincidence, random directional travel, territorial patrol route. But the line was too straight, too purposeful, like she'd known exactly where to go. The other bears, David said. Trail cameras. Kyle swiped to different images. 3 different bears captured on motion-activated cameras, all traveling toward the ravine location within the critical 2-hour window. Different directions, different starting points, converging. No food source there, Kyle said. We checked. No carcass, no berry concentration, no salmon run, nothing that would attract multiple bears. Territorial overlap? These 4? No overlap in their normal ranges. We've identified the scarred male from previous camera captures. His territory is 3 miles north. The subadult female ranges east. They shouldn't have been anywhere near that location. David pulled the tablet closer, studied the convergence pattern. Statistical probability of 4 bears randomly arriving at a resource-empty location within 2 hours. He ran rough calculations in his head. Less than 0.03%. They came because what? How? He spent the next week writing, paper draft, formal structure, every protocol followed. Coordinated response behavior in Ursus arctos, a case study. Introduction, methods, results, discussion, timeline documented, audio analysis included, GPS data mapped, witness testimony appended. He concluded carefully, conservatively. The observed behavior suggests long-distance communication and collaborative problem-solving abilities that exceed current behavioral models. Further research urgently needed. Sarah reviewed it, suggested minor changes, encouraged submission. "It's solid work, David. Let the data speak." He submitted to Journal of Wildlife Behavior. Rejection arrived 72 hours later. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Audio analysis insufficient to support conclusions regarding intentional communication. Recommend attributing behavior to coincidental congregation at site of human distress. Journal of Animal Cognition. Next, methodology sound, but interpretation exceeds data. Multiple alternative explanations exist for observed behavior. Suggest revised analysis focusing on individual bear responses rather than collaborative framework. Behavioral ecology. Subject matter falls outside current theoretical models for ursine cognition. Recommend additional controlled studies before field observation claims. 3 journals. 3 rejections. Each one acknowledging his data was solid, his documentation meticulous. Each one refusing to accept what the data showed. The 4th journal wouldn't even send it to review. Editor's note: while we appreciate the detailed field observations, claims of coordinated problem-solving and human recruitment in grizzly, bears require neurological and cognitive evidence beyond behavioral documentation. Consider resubmitting with revised conclusions. David sat in his hospital room, now rehabilitation facility room, staring at the rejection emails. He documented the impossible with scientific rigor, and science rejected it. Not because the data was flawed, because the data was too revolutionary. Those bears had saved his life through intelligence the scientific establishment refused to acknowledge, and David understood with crushing clarity: some truths are too large for the frameworks built to contain them. 6 months later, walking with a cane through Yellowstone headquarters reviewing his options, David made a choice. If traditional publication wouldn't work, he'd find another way. 6 months after the accident, David returned to the ravine. His leg had healed as well as a shattered femur could. Titanium rod, permanent; limp, permanent; chronic pain, manageable with discipline. The orthopedic surgeon had been blunt: he'd never hike backcountry alone again. Too much residual instability, too much risk of re-injury. David went anyway, not alone. Sarah accompanied him, both carrying bear spray, emergency beacon activated, ranger station notified. Every protocol followed, but he needed to see the place again, needed to stand where he'd almost died and understand what had happened. The hike took twice as long as it should have. His leg protested every uneven step, cane essential on steep terrain. Sarah matched his pace without comment, patient in the way of field researchers accustomed to waiting. They reached the ravine at mid-morning. The fallen timber that had concealed it was more visible now. David knew what to look for. The ravine itself looked smaller than he remembered. 23 feet that had contained infinity. Wildflowers grew where he'd bled. Strange comfort in that, life feeding on his near death. The granite shelf showed no other evidence of what had happened. Nature erases human drama quickly. "This is where you lay," Sarah said, standing at the bottom after careful descent. Not a question. "Here." David pointed with his cane. F3117 appeared there, at that edge. The others spread along the rim. Bear tracks everywhere, fresh grizzly scat on the game trail, territorial markers on trees. This was active bear country, well used, frequently traveled. "She knows this place," Sarah said. "Her territory overlaps this site. She probably travels through here weekly." "But how did she know I was here that day? I was silent, unmoving after the fall, 1.5 miles away when I went down." Sarah had no answer. Science had no answer. They climbed back out, Sarah helping haul David's uncooperative leg over difficult sections. At the top, they sat on fallen logs, sharing water, catching breath. Movement in the tree line. F317 emerged with 2 yearling cubs, healthy young, both thriving, learning to forage under their mother's guidance. She saw them. David and Sarah froze, hands moving slowly toward bear spray, and stopped. The cubs continued forward. F317 huffed sharply. They stopped immediately, well trained. She stood on her hind legs, threat assessment posture, normal behavior, evaluating the situation. But she held the position longer than necessary. 10 seconds, 15, looking directly at David across 50 yards of meadow, then dropped to all fours, huffed to her cubs, moved parallel to their position, not approaching, not fleeing, walking laterally, maintaining distance, guiding her young along the tree line. She paused once, looked back, then continued into the forest, cubs following. "She knew it was me," David said. "David, Bear Vision can't recognize individual humans at this distance, not with certainty." "Then how do you explain what just happened?" Sarah was silent. Long enough that David turned to look at her. "I can't," she finally said. "I can't explain any of this." They sat there as afternoon shadows lengthened. David's leg ached, but he didn't want to move. Didn't want to leave this place where something impossible had happened. Where 4 bears had gathered to save a life. Where science's careful frameworks had shattered against the reality of animal intelligence, too complex to measure. "Maybe cognition isn't a ladder," Sarah said quietly, "with humans at the top and everything else below. Maybe it's more like different languages, different ways of knowing. We measure bear intelligence by human standards and decide they're limited. But what if they're just different? What if they know things we haven't learned to recognize?" Standing where he'd almost died, watching the forest where F317 had disappeared with her cubs, David felt something shift in his understanding. Not collapse, shift, opening. Those bears had saved him through intelligence he couldn't prove, couldn't publish, couldn't explain. But lack of explanation didn't make it less real. 3 months later, an email arrived from a researcher David had never met. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, bear specialist from Hokkaido, Japan. Subject line, "I have documented similar behavior." And everything changed again. Dr. Yuki Tanaka's email was brief. "I read your unpublished paper through informal research networks. I have documented similar coordinated behavior in Ussuri brown bears, 3 separate cases over 8 years, all rejected by peer review. I am not alone. May we speak?" David called her immediately. 13-hour time difference meant reaching her at dawn in Hokkaido, but she answered on the second ring. "Dr. Thornton, thank you for calling." Her English was precise, slightly formal. "I have waited years to speak with someone who would understand." She sent files while they talked. 3 meticulously documented cases. First, 4 bears surrounded a lost child in the forest for 6 hours, maintaining protected perimeter, keeping wolves at distance until search teams arrived. Second, 2 bears blocked a hiking trail, refusing to move, eventually leading confused hikers away from an area where an avalanche occurred 20 minutes later. Third, 3 bears engaged in what appeared to be intentional teaching behavior. Adult demonstrating salmon-catching technique, while 2 subadults observed, taking turns practicing under supervision. Each case documented with video, audio, multiple witnesses. Each case submitted to peer-reviewed journals. Each case rejected. "They said I was anthropomorphizing," Yuki said, voice tight. "That I saw intention where only instinct existed. But Dr. Thornton, I have studied these bears for 19 years. I know instinct. This was not instinct." Over the following 2 weeks, 5 more researchers contacted David. The informal network spreading, researchers who'd been isolated in their extraordinary observations finding each other. Dr. Elena Popescu, Romania. 4 bears surrounded lost child, maintained protective formation for 9 hours, rejected publication. Dr. Marcus Webb, British Columbia. 3 grizzlies appeared to guide lost snowshoers away from avalanche danger zone. Video documentation, rejected publication, Dr. Sergei Volkov, Kamchatka. 5 bears engaged in coordinated fishing with apparent intentional teaching of younger bears, rejected publication. Every researcher told the same story: extraordinary behavior, meticulous documentation, professional rejection. Sarah helped David organize a video conference. 8 researchers across 7 countries, 17 time zones, coordinated. They shared data for 3 hours, comparing cases, analyzing patterns. 43 documented cases over 17 years, bears demonstrating collaborative problem-solving, protective behavior toward humans in distress, apparent teaching, coordinated responses to danger, recruitment behavior. Statistical analysis showed clear patterns. This wasn't random, wasn't coincidence, wasn't anthropomorphic projection. Combined probability of coincidence, Sarah calculated, running numbers across datasets, less than 0.0001%. This is real, this is systematic. Bears are demonstrating cognitive abilities we've insisted they don't possess. The group decided to write a collective paper. Coordinated Cognitive Behavior in Ursus Species, a multi-site analysis. 18 authors, 7 countries, 43 documented cases. They worked for 4 months, every researcher contributing data, methodology reviewed and cross-checked, conclusions worded carefully. The paper was rigorous, conservative. It didn't claim bears possessed human-level intelligence, only that observed behaviors exceeded current theoretical models and warranted serious reconsideration of ursine cognitive abilities. They submitted to Nature. Rejection. While the compilation of field observations is interesting, the interpretive framework lacks neurological foundation. Behavioral observations alone cannot support claims of this magnitude. Science Magazine. The data collection is impressive, but conclusions challenge fundamental assumptions about ursine cognition without providing mechanistic explanation. PLOS 1. 14 months under review, endless requests for additional analysis, ultimately rejected. Unable to reconcile observations with established understanding of bear behavior and cognition. Recording these patterns, documenting what happened, this is how science eventually changes. If you believe truth matters more than comfort, subscribe to this channel. David sat in his office, surrounded by rejection letters, looking at the most comprehensive documentation of bear cognition ever assembled. 18 researchers, 7 countries, 43 cases, thousands of hours of observation, and no journal would publish it. "We don't need to publish it," Yuki said during their next conference call. "The behavior exists whether science accepts it or not." She was right. Those bears had saved David's life through intelligence the establishment wouldn't acknowledge. That didn't make it less true. Truth doesn't require validation to exist. But sitting there holding paper 48, the most important work of his career, David understood. Some truths run ahead of science's ability to accept them, and sometimes witnesses carry those truths until the frameworks catch up. 2 years after the accident, David returned to the ravine one final time. 64 years old now, leg healed but never the same, carrying weight that wasn't entirely physical. He went alone this time, against protocol, against sense, but some things required solitude. He brought 3 fresh salmon, expensive, difficult to carry with his cane, and unsteady gait. But bears understand offerings, understand respect. He placed them near the ravine edge where F317 had first appeared, then retreated to a fallen log 20 yards distant. Early morning, mist rising from the forest floor, silence so complete he could hear his own heartbeat. He sat without expectation. She might not come, probably wouldn't come, but he needed to try. F317 emerged from the tree line within 30 minutes. 2-year-old cubs with her now, nearly independent, massive young bears learning the final lessons before solitary life. She approached the salmon, stopped 10 feet away, looked directly at David, full eye contact, sustained. Bears avoid eye contact. It signals aggression, challenge, threat. Holding a human's gaze goes against every instinct. F317 held his gaze for 14 seconds. David counted, breath frozen, not daring to move. Then she approached the salmon, took one in her jaws, dropped it for her cubs to share. Took the second, the third, efficient, calm, no wariness, like she'd expected this, like she'd known he would come. She paused before returning to the forest, turned back once, looked at him again, then disappeared into the trees, cubs following. David sat alone, trembling, not from fear, from recognition. She knew. 2 years later, she knew exactly who he was. She'd remembered the human from the ravine, the one 4 bears had saved through impossible collaboration. When David told me this story, his hands shook the entire time. Not from age, from carrying truth too large for words. He showed me everything: audio files, GPS data, spectral analysis, witness statements, rejected papers, all documented with scientific precision, all dismissed as impossible. But here's what haunts me. David spent 40 years studying these animals. He knows their behavior patterns, their cognitive limitations, their instinctual responses with the intimacy of decades. And he's telling you this wasn't instinct, this was intelligence. 8 researchers across 7 countries have documented similar patterns. 43 cases of bears demonstrating collaborative cognition in crisis contexts, coordinated problem-solving, protective behavior toward humans, teaching, recruitment, none published in peer-reviewed journals, all filed away as anomalies too extraordinary for established frameworks. Science says bears can't do what David witnessed, but science also said birds couldn't use tools until Jane Goodall documented it, said elephants couldn't recognize themselves in mirrors until they did, said dolphins couldn't understand syntax until they demonstrated it repeatedly. Maybe we're asking the wrong question, not are they as smart as us, but what forms of intelligence exist that we haven't learned to recognize? Maybe cognition isn't a single ladder with humans at the top. Maybe it's a forest with different paths to knowing, different ways of being intelligent. If you believe animals possess wisdom, we're only beginning to understand. Write, "They know more than we think" in the comments. Share your own experiences with animal intelligence, the moments that made you question everything science told you was impossible. David never published paper 48, but he keeps it on his desk, all 93 pages, with "rejected" stamped across the front in red ink. "Every time I see it," he told me, voice breaking, "I remember 4 bears standing at that ravine edge, trying to save my life, succeeding through intelligence I'd spent 30 years insisting they didn't have. They tried branches, materials, collaboration. When physical solutions failed, they recruited humans. They maintained vigil for 4 hours until help arrived." He stopped, composing himself. "They were smarter than my science, kinder than my understanding, more capable than a century of research said was possible, and I can't prove it in a way anyone will accept. But I was there. I saw every second. I have 4 hours and 16 minutes of audio documentation, GPS data, witness testimony, and I will go to my grave knowing those bears saved me because they chose to, because they understood, because in ways we can't measure and science won't." Acknowledge they cared? He's right. You can't prove wonder. You can only witness it, and sometimes that has to be enough.